I think with that, I can welcome everybody to 154 Contemporary Art Fair panel, creating public installations across Africa and its diaspora. I'm joined by Princess Marilyn Douala Bell, David Ogunmuyiwa, and Zach Oven. Yes, and I'm George Mahashe. I'll be the discussant. I might be a little bit nervous for a second, but I'll get there. So everyone, welcome. And thank you very much for taking the time to actually be here with us and to listen to us. I'm not going to take up too much time with introduction. I know screen fatigue is a real thing. So with that, I think I'm going to introduce our panelists. I will start with Princess Marilyn Douala Bell. She is the founder of doual'art and a very respected figure in the art on the continent. We're also joined by David Ogunmuyiwa, who is an architect and an educator. And he is also a very well-practiced architect and respected. And we are also joined by Zekov, who is an artist, and he will also be sharing some of his projects that he has been working on. So with that, I think how we are going to run the session is I'm going to give all the panelists 5 to 7 minutes to just sort of introduce what they have on their plate, what they're thinking about. And afterwards we can move on to a discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions later on. So today we will begin again with Princess Marlin, and I will give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be with you and to share something which is in my mind and in the mind of my team. So I'm running doual'art since 1991, and it's a project and a dream we had in that period, 30 years ago, to impulse a new way of being in public spaces, a new way to people to meet and to look at the city as a place for discussion, for sharing, and not a place for fighting. Doual'art was born after the quite civil war. It was a very, very dark and violent moment, and the street was really the place where people were fighting each against the other. So we have two very big spaces where we work. We invite artists to work in the white cube. We have the white cube, and most of the time it's outside the walls. And something which is very important for us is about how we can create emblems, create landmarks for people to recognize themselves, to belong to space, or to be part of something around them. This is what I'd like to share with you for the moment. If it's not enough, let's say, let's me know.
That is good. I think that will work. David, do you have, you can get your initial prompts?
Yeah, thank you first of all for inviting me to join this amazing panel and to be involved with 154. So I'm an architect, and I am from a practice called Architecture Doing Place, and the kind of strange name is indicative of our concerns. So we focus on the idea of place and the idea of place and how it forms people. But we come at this through looking at the intersection between art and architecture, specifically trying to develop an architecture that is generated through the lens of fine art practices, as far as we can do it. There is a really interesting conversation about the distinction between architectural practices and fine art practices, and how you can really get mixed up by blurring the boundaries between the two, because I think they are distinct practices. And what we look to do is respect our artistic processes, but also use them to investigate and influence what we do. And the reason we do that is because primarily what we are urbanists. So we believe in the city, we believe in settlements, we believe in wherever people are, because we believe in people. And we focus on end users. And one of the ways that we think about how these, how buildings can be generated from the imagination of end users, from the influences and what's important to end users, is by looking at the things that concern them and how they occupy space. So the kind of spatial consequence of all the things that we look at, but also that comes from the imagination, it comes from the mind, and that's what we like to kind of focus on. And we talk about quite often how our built environment forms all of us inescapably. In fact, our shared built environment forms all of us. So where we're born, where we meet partners, where we go to school, where we live, these are all spaces that we live in, but they're also a kind of, they're a kind of set physical spaces, but they also become our psychological space. And all sorts of writers, poets, and theorists and artists have reflected on these kind of situations. So we like to think about those issues, and that really means that there's a kind of utilitarian aspect to some of the things that we do, and a kind of practical, pragmatic set of issues about what we want to do. So for instance, we wouldn't put anybody in a room without any windows, because that has an impact on their kind of psychological state. But what they see out that window and what they imagine out of that window, and the view that we frame of the horizon, is kind of hopefully really meaningful to them, and then it's meaningful to the place. So there's the idea of reference point and public space. There's the idea of the kind of the often when you invite lay people to talk about architecture, the first thing that they clock onto, which is really important, is the idea of kind of the inside and the outside, and the kind of connection between the inside and the outside. And that is because there is a kind of genuine reality about that. But one of the ways we like to think about that is the connection between the public and the private realms, the public and the private space. So I'm really interested in public spaces and how it affects the interior spaces, and vice versa. But in terms of art practice, one of the things that are one of the really interesting things about that is kind of the idea of performance, and the idea of events and happenings. And in the context of this conversation about public art, does public art have to be a physical object, or can it be a kind of set of happenings, a set of, there's a kind of European school from the 1960s called kind of situationist art, which is about a kind of set of productions, performances in public spaces that then activate that space. And developers all around the world are always talking about activating public space, because one of the things about public space is that it's scarce, so it's a commodity, so people buy it, so it becomes private really quickly. But then when they made it private, people then need to make it active, because if you just block off things and fence around it, it becomes an empty kind of wasteland in a desert. So that's kind of one of the things I hope we can touch on as we go through our conversations. And then personally, I'm really interested in the idea of a kind of mythology and personal mythology, and how that in an aesthetic way influences design and influences the kind of outcomes and the products and the imagination of designers and creatives. And I'm really hoping to kind of pick from Zach and Princess Marilyn's imagination.
Hi, well, I'll continue from there. I'm Zach Ove. I'm an artist, and I also curate. Last year, I curated Get Up, Stand Up Now at Somerset House, which was an exhibition looking at the last 50 years in contributions of Black British arts in the UK and from abroad, and how really that had bearing on changing the face of Britain permanently, and what those influences were, the connectivity through those situations, and how that interfaced with British culture to change the face of Britain today. I think the arts has huge influence when allowed in public spaces to make a contribution and a voice. I began with 154 outside in the courtyard years ago with my installation of The Invisible Men. And when doing so, I began to research the history of Somerset House and discovered the Mask of Blackness had been performed there in 1605. What was interesting to me again was, growing up in Britain, I felt that there had been a huge contribution made by people of color in the last 400 years that wasn't recognized. And I myself petition now to try to find public spaces that could perhaps then tell the story of those Black Britons and their interface, their contribution, if you like, to British culture, and how by recognizing them, we might help tell hidden stories and histories that help us really discover who we are and who we've been. Unlike you guys, a lot of my work is to do with mythology in that sense. It began in the carnival, and I began with an interest in the mythologies that were being played out there. And one of the things I realized that if mythologies aren't kept alive and given new world materials and new dialogue, they die. So one of the things I look at in my practice is how to interject nuances that reflect the times in a way, materials that speak about now and the future, as well as the past, that give old world traditions a new voice. This has led me to casting of African masks, etc., and statues in resins and graphite to recontextualize old world histories and give them a new world voice in that sense. I'm fascinated in this conversation for a number of reasons. It's interesting how we all look at public spaces and how we can congeal ideas that might activate those spaces to speak about us in context. One of the things I'm hoping in the future is that we will be more active as architects and artists and curators in seeking out these spaces and putting work in them that really helps to build a platform for what we're doing and saying. One of the things that's been interesting to me in my journey, and this was passed to me from my father, was a retelling of history and an equalizing of issues that had been, where we'd been misled through, if you like, our colonial upbringings, the kind of education that we were given, and how we kind of begin to look at ways to champion an equalizing in terms of who we have been, what our contribution has been, where we were, etc. A retelling of hidden stories, if you like, where we had been left out, filling in the blanks. And I think what's interesting about where we come together is how we begin to find ways to fulfill that. So I think from that point, we can begin, really, can't we? I mean,
yes, please go ahead.
Yes, yes. I'm not, well, I think we have to change our vocabulary.
Okay.
I think, I mean, public space means space outside, outdoor.
Yeah.
And we are used to speak about, this is a translation from French.
Yeah.
We are used to speak about urban,
yeah,
social areas.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we must speak about people, human beings.
And communities.
If we speak, and communities.
Yeah.
And if we say public space, this reminds the space outdoor. So we work in the same way with human beings in social areas.
Yeah.
And we are also involved, and I think we are speaking we have been chosen to speak about that, about how we can help people to have new narratives of their own lives and to share it and to invent their future.
Yeah.
Really the challenge. And the artists are, of course, the person who can help, but the creativity of people is also to be challenged, to be included, to create those new narratives for themselves, for ourselves, and to try to get out of what has been imposed as a governance, the way of those leaders, public leaders, and we have to change, to move on and change the paradigm.
Yeah.
And I'm really with you, Zach, when you are speaking about processes, methodologies, because this is much more important than the results.
Yeah.
Even if the result is sometimes something where people can recognize themselves and say, wow, I'm there, I recognize what I am, part of me, or I hate that, and I'm not there. This is the dialogue we are involved, we are pushing is so important, is those social areas.
I agree.
David, do you want to come in yet?
I think it's really interesting actually, because I was just reflecting on what Princess Marilyn was saying, and it is something that never occurred to me, in that other creatives will talk about, and you're absolutely right, Princess Marilyn, one of the things is about language and what we emphasize. And I imagine that other artists are trying to communicate with their public, or their kind of the kind of the viewer, the gaze, the people that they're trying to produce something for. If I can put it as crudely as I'm being a bit clumsy with that. But as architects, we tend to think about space, and that's a kind of irreducible thing that we have to, because that's our medium. So in our sense, what we're trying to do is almost invert that and try and imbue some sense of humanity and character and use and meaning into space. But we have to use space. There's no getting away from that. Otherwise, we would be a different type of practitioner. So I think that's really interesting to kind of highlight.
Yeah, and it's nice when architects and artists can work in unison, that the artist can bring a narrative that can be developed in such a way. And I think actually in getting artists to make works for public space, we need more alliances with architectural practices in order to break those borders. Because often to make a public artwork, or to even get through the sifting of paperwork that's necessary, one needs to work in counterpart, so it's nice when we can find collusions in that sense between our practices that help us get there. One of the things I was very firm about with Get Up, Stand Up last year was that the narratives that we looked at and tried to include were very positive in terms of how they were fueling the audience. By that, I mean, looking at artists who were finding creative solutions or ways around issues, problems, etc., versus kind of a lull in that. So I was looking for people that were really solution seekers in their practices, people who stood up with a sense of affirmation in trying to find the way through a situation. And this is something I think is particularly interesting to me when we start to look at the narrative of an artwork, or a public artwork in that sense, what it speaks about, how it challenges its moments, and how it leads us to really to the notion that we can do more, that we can champion our own situations, that it becomes something that really gives us a lease of life and is encouraging in that sense. And I'm interested in how we develop those situations and those stories in a way.
I mean, for me, the question that I would want to add to the mix, we are talking about art, we're talking about architects, but ultimately when we're talking about public space, it is really the domain of the administrator in South Africa, we'd say something like public work. So I think the discussion you're talking about it's not just about getting somebody that can navigate the bylaws. It also involves somebody that can navigate the public. Yeah. So the role of the public administrator of some sort. I don't know if I've got a way to put it, but I think that's one dimension that I think would be important to put into the mix about where does the public affairs person feature in, because we quickly move to the community, but in between the community and the artist, there's always that public figure, that politician or that administrator that has to do the work.
Great. I think what's been interesting recently is we've seen a backlash in the last year to, if you like, public art that we had taken for granted from the colonial era, that spoke about a certain kind of bureaucracy, that suddenly this year, people have said, no, this is enough. These people were slave masters, they were indecent. We no longer want them to herald our communities, right? And I'm interested now in how we move beyond that, what we replace in those situations, which communities we choose to revere in those moments. Because I think it's interesting when you grow up in any city, be it Lagos or Johannesburg or London or New York, there you are knowing that African hands built the majority of what we look at in terms of the architectural feats of the white Western world. Yet we're not revered for being a part of that. And we look at the history of those cities and those communities, and we find champions in all sorts of areas, not only for the equality of Black people, but people that have contributed to the modernization of humanity. And in that sense, where are they? Why aren't they recognized? How can we build platforms to see more of our heroes and heroines that start to build an archive of who we have been alongside other communities in founding these situations? And I'm interested in artists that not only looking to the past, but in that sense, trying to broaden people's horizons in terms of what public art can be and what it speaks about. And I'm very interested to know what you guys think and how we might share ideas that enlighten in that sense.
Okay. Any comebacks? Or rather, Ed?
Princess Marilyn?
Yeah,
Well, I've got
go ahead.
some things. So it's really interesting because I think almost in the answer to your question first, George, because I think you're absolutely right. But I don't think that should be the role of the architect. I almost feel that what that needs is, and that's where other people who are architect adjacent, if I can use that term, are used for that. Because what artists need, I would suggest, are enablers. So, for instance, if Zach, you've probably got some gallerists, you've got people, Princess Marilyn, potentially, that's what people do to create space for art. And I think there's also, there's another kind of set of practitioners that should be creating the interface for art to work properly, because it's a real specialism, and it's a way of kind of trying to communicate with people who don't have the imagination of the artist. And I think the artist specialism is a different specialism, and they shouldn't have to kind of almost sully themselves with these kind of narrow frames of things. However, one of the things I do think that they offer, and certainly Get Up, Stand Up did this in so many ways last year, is almost give ourselves as practitioners and creators a sense of ourselves as makers and cultural producers. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's about setting this kind of type of narrative, this overarching vision that starts with the point of view that we are here. We have always been doing this. Frankly,
agreed.
Just that we haven't been shown or highlighted it or illuminated in what we've been doing, but we've always been doing this since the beginning of time. It's not a new thing. So it's a kind of a sense of ourselves as producers allows us to produce more. It gives us the confidence and the reassurance and the kind of for people who want to kind of reach towards that, there's a kind of pathway for them to follow.
I mean, I feel that I grew up in the invisible generation in that sense, especially in Europe. Sorry, go ahead, Princess Marilyn.
Yes.
Thank you. I wanted a few examples. I'd like to share with you two thoughts. One is architecture is not walls. It's the space where you live, how you occupy the space. And walls are not obliged, it's not obligation to have a wall to say this is an architecture. And then we have offered an amphitheater, open air theater in one neighborhood. And it was very interesting because it was a Belgian artist invited by us, and he spent a lot of time with people in this area, a lot of time. And then those people with who he was working with, speaking, he was not working with them, he was speaking with them. He was taking their words and trying to offer his words. And there were this white person in this very black and very deep root area. And people were looking at themselves and they were saying, oh, this white person is coming to us and we are someone. And he offered a space of dialogue to those people and to let them have a kind of better way of their own representation. He helped them to look at themselves as human beings in that very unstructured area. And I think David said that earlier, the first thing was psychologically, people had now a space where they were, recognized. And this is the first architecture that is in the head.
Absolutely.
Second one is an open air space, and it's at the heart of this area, and it's a place where they can do all what they want. A place for games for kids, a place for meetings, a place for crying when there's some funerals and so on. And this is something which has structured the collective lives of these people. And this is also something we are fighting for, and it takes a lot of time. And the fact to invite people coming from abroad countries is so important.
Yeah.
To give to us, to me, the idea that I'm alive. I'm someone.
Yeah. Sure.
I'm somebody.
Yeah.
I have other examples, but this is one I also wanted to share with you, with all of you, to speak about how we can deconfine I don't know the translation, the good translation, but deconfine our identity, where, most of the time we are in a box.
Right.
Most of the time we are doing the same things. We don't like it. We don't like ourselves. And then this is with art, with the gesture of an artist, of a creative person. With that, we help people to get outside of their common daily life.
Okay. Yeah. It's so important. I hope with the show we did last year, it was a house that worked in the same way that you described. Sadly, I think in London, this kind of place still doesn't exist for people of color here at all, which is ridiculous. And we need more institutions that are our own as well, in order to house these situations that become ours. So if you like, the house of us in that sense. It's a discussion in Britain. I mean, we were talking today about other institutions that try to work in that way in various satellites off the continent, like the Studio Museum in New York and the Underground Museum in Los Angeles, and in the past in London, the Africa Center, and how these small satellite institutions that become specialists to these kind of topics serve us so well. And I hope that we don't always have to think in a big scale, that we can have more smaller institutions that do this kind of specialist work. It's very important, you're right, for people to see themselves and to understand how their stories are viewed by the community and beyond, in that sense, like,
What I like about what Princess Marilyn was also saying was that, or at least I hope I've understood, and maybe I've misunderstood usefully and creatively, is this idea of, I love this, I love the idea of Africans talking about art in the context of ourselves and what it can do to us personally, rather than in a context of opposition to a kind of European hegemony, which it is. And I like both of those things are absolutely true. It's almost kind of one of the other points I want to make about diaspora. But certainly this idea of, again, it's trite to say it, but it doesn't make it any less true, that art expands the mind and it allows us to look at things in a different way.
Yeah.
And just that kind of opportunity, that space that an interlocutor can have, that comes into a space and has a conversation, a specialist conversation about a kind of focus on a particular thing from an artistic lens that allows us to reflect on ourselves, is so powerful and useful. I think in our lives, in our quotidian lives, like Princess Marilyn was talking about, where we're continuously assailed by all sorts of very demanding kind of things to deal with, bills to pay at the end of the month, Black Lives Matter, just all sorts of kind of daily issues that assail us. This space for reflection is also a kind of, it's a gift to ourselves as well. It's a kind of self-compassion to ourselves as a kind of African diaspora, to have this space, to have the opportunity to reflect on ourselves in this creative, imaginative, boundless and endless way. I think that's really important for us to kind of preserve and hold on to. And that's another thing I've got to say that Get Up, Stand Up provided just a moment, an oasis in a kind of relentless stream of, daily worries, to have headspace.
The other thing for me that was important with that was to try and show the connectivity between generations and between the kind of, if you like, not only practices, but conversations people were having in their work, and how different periods of art have influenced others, to show, if you like, the infectiousness that happens when one begins making art. And this obviously came to me through my father, in seeing him years before I began my practice, nurturing other artists who, the thing of mentoring, in a sense, is what I'm really getting to, and how one generation have influenced another, and how that baton has been passed. And with with Get Up, Stand Up, really, I was trying to show how these generations had connected those values through different types of practices, and how sometimes somebody plants a seed in a certain moment that's picked up on years later by somebody else who runs with that in, say, sculpture, where that may have begun in a piece of writing or a piece of film or a piece of music. But that sense of connectivity, and also the resistance within the arts that was shared in all those moments. Sorry.
Also the exuberance of that, Zach. I love the kind of I think you said, I'm not sure you said the word, I think you said something approaching the word joy, which is something I wrote down. And that kind of, again, I think that's part of that reflection. It's a kind of outcome of that reflection. It might not always be joy, it might just be, it might be melancholy, it might be all sorts of other things, but there's a kind of exuberance that allows us, and that is something that is common in a kind of overarching way in African culture. That's, you know, kind of what, if the world has a lens of us, has a kind of, you know, shorthand for us, it's about that exuberance. And that allows that process of transferring from one creative medium to another, to another, to another. And that's why we try and use art practice, actually. Again, it's occurred to me during this conversation that the reason that we try and use art practice to inform what we're doing is to infuse that sense of a kind of exuberance and a freedom that is often constrained in architecture, which is a very austere kind of Middle European idea of a process. And we kind of, like, lots of cultures don't have the word architect, they have the word, I worked in the Middle East for a while, and they have the word mohandis, which means a kind of builder, engineer, but it doesn't mean architect. It's a kind of different, it's a different set of concerns and cultures.
Yes. You are, I just want, once again, about vocabulary, or about words, how we speak. What you said is the word people are using for describing not architecture, but something around architecture, right? What we are working on, it's not, well, I was wanted to make a link, but I was wanted to speak about something we have done. So there's no link with what you just said. I was wanted to say also something which is very important for us. We are really working for citizenship. And we discovered that someone speak about the virtual space, you know. I don't speak about, I just want to say, simply want to say that it's very interesting when people try to explain what happened in their area. Sometimes they don't speak about art, people. They speak about development. Something happened and it changed the way their mobility, the way they are, you know, the links, the relationship they have with abroad countries and so on. So something is happening in their imagination and so on. But the way they are speaking about what happened is very interesting because their vocabulary has changed. The way that they are using new vocabularies, they are trying to speak. They are speaking about the same thing, and they are trying to create a way of understanding together. You know, so I mean, an artwork in the field help to invent a new vocabulary and a new way for people to exchange, to share what happened and what they feel about what happened. And this is another way to build a consciousness, to build a society. So I was just wanted to speak about that.
Okay.
Cool. I think before we've got about 20 minutes left, and I think there's been a lot of bouncing, which is really, really interesting. I think one thing that I sort of want to bring back, there's a bit of discussion about what exactly constitutes public space. So there's the question of being inside, outside. There's a question of not needing walls. And then obviously, Zach, with your work, there's something very specific about it being in the public and it being a particular size. So it's not a building, but it's an actual object. So for me, I think there's an important question to think about, because from my perspective, as somebody that's lived in Joburg for a very long time, when people think public space, they always think about spend money on fixed things, put a bench, put grass so that people can sit, but then you can't sit on the grass. So I think for me, there's something about when we are talking about, and you've already touched on it in different ways, but I think if I had to ask you as one last attempt to just deal with what each and every one of the panelists really thinks in relation to the physicality or lack of physicality of the idea of public space. I don't know if that's something that can.
I don't quite understand the question. So just break it down. When you say physicality, and what are you
saying?
at?
So, for example, when one thinks of a public installation, you know, there was you can think about it as a sculpture. You can think about it as a pavilion. For example, I was really excited by I think it's called Portobello. You know, as it's a space that you come and you be in.
Yeah.
There's also been a conversation around performance as public. So for me, as somebody that lives outside of a sort of European, I mean, we all kind of live in a European context, but
absolutely.
About space beyond the building and the park, which is something that we are all kind of, or rather, how do you think about public space beyond the park or a building? It's something that I'm curious about. I don't know if it's something you guys can engage, but it's something that I think has come through in all that has come out today.
Yeah, I don't mind having a crack at that, and I think so. I suppose one of my starting point for this is almost what I'm interested in as a kind of creative producer. And what I'm generally predominantly interested in is a kind of human form and human immersion in a kind of physical environment. So I think for me, it is a physical environment. However, I recognize that there is a kind of virtual aspect to all of our lives. Now there's a kind of other world. It's not actually that new. It's at least 30 years old. We've been kind of immersed in, you know, a sense of a kind of a realm, a digital or a media realm beyond ourselves for a long time now, and kind of being able to imagine that. But as architects, we always think about not just a public space, but it's in relation to what's implied by that is a couple of other spaces. One is the semi-public place. So where are you in a place that is both part of the rest of the world, very communal, but is also kind of partially you can put yourself in an African context. I might talk about that historically as a kind of compound where you've got a kind of communal extended family environment, and you're sharing different kind of spaces that you might have entirely private to you. And then you've got spaces where you might come together with more members of your family, but not everybody in the wider settlement, in the village. But that also implies a kind of private realm, which is entirely of your own, psychology and imagination. And I almost feel like the virtual world is a lot about that private. For me, it's got more in common with that private realm than it's got to do with a broader public communal realm. There are obviously ways in which we can all interact together now. So I'm not necessarily interested in the conversation about the veracity of what public means in that sense. But I think for me, it's not as much, it's a tool. It's not as much interest. I prefer artworks in public spaces that have a reference point of a kind of communal shared experience that people can journey together, that people can react to together. Even if you don't like it, there's a kind of reaction that's shared. I don't know if anybody else has had this experience over the various lockdowns and quarantine periods that we've had around the world, but I was fine until the most recent one, where I was very fine being by myself in my own company as often as possible. But what I missed was those kind of incidental, hearing a conversation going past in the background from people going past you might never meet again, but it's a kind of sense of a public zone that cannot be replicated inside your own head with any truth.
Okay.
I mean, I think that also kind of brings the question of how are we imagining the virtual? Because I think at the moment, the virtual is still privileging the individual. So I'll just put that. I don't know if Zach, Princess Marlin, you wanna come back into this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think for me, I'm less concerned about the virtual. I mean, coming back to what David was saying just now, I'm hoping post the COVID world, we return to some normality where we can commune as a community and be together and congregate. One of the things I've long been affected by was the lack of our presence in public spaces in cities that our hands virtually built in that sense. And I feel that to become a part of the history of the making of these societies, we need to be recognized as such. Therefore, one of the things I try to advocate as much as possible is reaching out to find spaces that speak about, if you like, people that I want to celebrate from my history as a Black Briton, or from the continent, or from the Caribbean. But the sense that we see ourselves amidst everybody else, right? That walking through London isn't just a journey through, if you like, the colonial masters of its past, but that there is a most socialist intervention in terms of what we recognize and who we choose to champion in public spaces and for what reasons. So I'm looking for a more socialist order in how those moments are ignited, what those histories talk about, how they will inform younger people in the future and inspire, and in keeping with the times, the removal of things that I see as obstacles, things that speak about inequality in history, that spoke about slavery, So I'm very much a part of a generation that wants to see that change implemented, so that we don't lose sight of those before us, to give us some idea of who to be in the future.
I just want to, just interject quickly on that as well, because I think what's really interesting about that, and I'd love to hear Princess Marilyn's view on this, is how that affects, because who is absent is, you're absolutely right, it's part of the story. But I think that is about our kind of diaspora condition, because in the UK, we have a very specific attitude to that. In the US, they have a very specific attitude to that. But in Africa, who's left out is a different person. Who's left out and who's celebrated. Yeah, exactly. And that's really, really interesting. I mean, I remember being in Johannesburg about a couple of years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, and I could easily have been in Switzerland. Right. It's a really interesting kind of who is left in and who's left out, even in Africa.
Yeah, I think the question of I've not seen the question of virtual, but the question of quality. This is not something which is universal. The notion of quality is not normative, and the danger sometimes for the architects and sometimes for some artists is to come with what I've learned and the norms. You have to do things in such a way and so on. The way people take advantage of an artwork or of space which has been redrawn or redesigned by an artwork, they will give the quality. They will say they will use it and make it ergonomic for themselves. I don't know. So, I mean, what is very interesting in my country, Cameroon, Douala, particularly where I live and where I work, we have such a freedom to do all what we want for the moment.
Mm.
Then the artist speaking with people or making an offer of something, help people to take advantage of it, to make the piece, the artwork, part of their daily life, and they decide the quality and the way they will use it and include that artwork in their own lives. So this is the most important for us. They don't, most of the time, well, sometimes, all depend on the artwork, but sometimes they don't feel it as creation and artwork. They feel it up as a gesture for the development of their area. You know? And
Absolutely.
It's very
I think, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Princess Marilyn. I was just going to say, what was fascinating about 154 and Get Up, Stand Up Now at Somerset House, right, is the notion of the house itself, right, in terms of what the architecture delivers as a platform for the artworks. One of the things I'm always fascinated by with Black art fairs globally is this sense of urbanization. And for me, often it doesn't work. And ironically, what held that show up and what holds 154 up in that building is this classical backdrop, right? That immediately gives, if you like, quite a regal backdrop to the artworks that are put on display. In some respects, what that does is for 154 or for Get Up, Stand Up, is it helps to equalize what we do on a world stage in order for other people to see it in the same light as European works, et cetera, right? Without taking us completely out of the remit. What I'm interested in the future is how architecture stemming from the Caribbean, from Africa, et cetera, permeates or creates spaces for these narratives to unfold upon, and what those spaces will look like to hold those narratives. So in that sense, how do we work in symbiosis? What are the kind of spaces that we need to create in order for artists revered, who make qualitative work of a revered nature, to be able to display those that again, give us an equalizer in terms of the stylistics, its modernization, etc. Because what we're really talking about is also the brokerage of culture amidst other world cultures, where we can show how we supersede in what we do, not only in the present, but for the future. And for me, for a long time, and I think for a lot of my group, we were rendered invisible on the world stage, and our mythologies, our artisans had been antiquated. So part of the battle has been, how do we reinterpret this? How do we recontemporize our culture? How do we really push hard to make sure that stylistically we're at the forefront of what's happening globally?
I mean, I would definitely say that if anyone's listening, we'd be delighted to create spaces like that if anyone wants to commission us.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I'd say. But I think it is so interesting that that it's so funny, because we almost have to define ourselves against what Europeans are already doing. And when I try to imagine what those spaces are, that have that grandeur, that have that natural grandeur. So Somerset House is like a quick shorthand, isn't it? And it's, you know, it's this kind of house, but it's in this position. It's spick and span. It's highly managed. There are so many people whose job is just to keep things clean there, and it's in the centre of London by the River Thames.
Absolutely.
If it was in the middle of, I don't know, Amsara in Azamar, I can never pronounce it properly, excuse me, the capital of Eritrea. But if it was somewhere out in the wilds of East Africa, it was really quiet, it was really dusty, it probably wouldn't have as much grandeur or experience. But what do we do? How do we
build African equivalent?
Absolutely.
Right?
That's the thing.
How do we have an aesthetic that is as revered, that competes with that has the same regal, befitting setting, right? That speaks about us. That uses,
but I think that's a
definitive aesthetic in its construction.
Absolutely, and I think that's a communal project, or at least it's a project that has to be, you know, it's a project that has to be owned by a broader set of people. So if I'm thinking about the new Modern Art Gallery in Cape Town, George, by Thomas Heatherwick, a white British architect, designer, it's a lovely building. It's really kind of eye-catching. But who were the African architects that had the opportunity to develop that and to kind of respond to that style? And I don't think that's the case. Often you will find architects that are, in order to get that aesthetic that you're talking about, which I think is problematic in many ways, actually a lot of the the people, the patrons who create those buildings will go and find what's called a star architect, a kind of very, very world famous architect who will happen to most likely be white, apart from with the honorable exception of Sir David Adjaye, who is but he can't necessarily do everything. And actually, it's probably useful if there's a broader sweep of men, women, people from across the African continent who can, who can do those things. Fantastic architects working across Africa at the moment, like Francis Kere, as well, who's been feted a lot in Europe. There's a lot of architectural talent there. There's a lot of kind of design, creative talent there. But how do we imagine, what in our own imaginations, what does that grandeur look like? It doesn't look like a colonial building. And I think one of the art forms that intimate that.
Else's house. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's not our own. So how do we
use
our aesthetic to forge our own building blocks in that sense?
Well, there's a kind of sense.
Our own history, our own aesthetic.
Absolutely. And there's a sense of kind of Afrofuturism that has influenced, I've forgotten the name. I can't believe I've forgotten the name of the movie, the very famous movie from a couple of years ago, with Chadwick Boseman. Black Panther, rest in peace.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of, in our imagination, there are cues and reference points that we have that can give grandeur to things. The pyramids do not look like Somerset House, and they don't have to, but they have a grandeur. And there's a kind of, there's a kind of reciprocity that we do, and we try and do that in our work currently in London, because we think, and we talk about it as a kind of ornamental narrative, because what we can do is bring a language that is beyond that very narrow vision of a kind of Middle European type of modernism that was highly problematic and highly exclusionary and highly, and if you look at any of the photos of those times anywhere in the world, one thing they have in common was the people that looked like me couldn't have owned them.
Hold on, let's get Princess Marlin in. And as we are running...
Those guys are men. I was wanting to speak. Thank you, George.
Guilty.
No, I think there is no, it's okay. I like the conversation.
And we've got two questions. Comments.
No, it's okay. Don't worry. I just want to say that we are in a very complex situation. The question of urbanization. We are more of 50% of the population now in Africa is living in cities. And their models shown by the TV and so on is the one they want, and they don't understand what it is exactly the way they can live in those kind of housing and so on, but they want that. And at the same time, they don't know how to live there. And this is the reason why I think it's very important the role of emerging their way of feeling, of thinking, their own discourses on the way they can habitate has to be should be done by art as a place of education to free the words, to free the way the people can influence the format, the dimension, and the housing. So, I mean, architects, sorry, I don't exactly know what this word is, but I think it's for living, for housing, you are in those kind of normalization. There is a room for everybody, there is a room for sleeping and so on. So, but previously in the former period, it was not like that, and it's now quite impossible to build as it was formerly. And at the same time, I don't know how you can, well, passing through art and education, you can maybe help people to define the way they want to live nowadays. I mean, my problem and the complexity is how we can break the models brought by the outside. to make people create their own way of creation, the habitation, the way of habitat. I don't know if I'm clear.
You're very clear. I mean, in the Caribbean, we do what we do resistance art because we're so scared of.
I think, Zach, we are losing you.
Oh.
But we are also, I think the internet is. No, we got you back.
You got me back?
Closing.
Okay.
We've got you back.
All right. I mean, my point to Princess Marilyn to amplify what she's saying was, in a way, we've inherited a culture, right? Partly it's one that we don't want, and we need to find ways to redefine art and should be away from that. In the Caribbean, the resistance art of the Caribbean is also trying to resist, if you like, the United States from consuming us. You know, otherwise we're queuing up to be 5th generation car park attendants in somebody else's back lot. Who are we? How do we keep individuality alive? How do we revere our own culture? How do we have aesthetic markers in buildings and in artworks that speak about us in a language that we see as ourselves? And how do we create a symbiosis between architecture and the narratives driven by the artist to sit side by side in the future that can talk about not only our history and our present, but the future to come?
Thank you. I think now I'm going to take closing. I think you've kind of made, we are at the end. David, do you want to come in? And then Princess Marlin. And then we had a question, but I think one of the questions been asked. There was a question around the Smithsonian in Washington by David Aji.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think with that, let's do it with a close.
Yeah, I mean,
have you seen his building?
I haven't seen it up close, but I love it, and I love the idea of it. Yeah. And I think, from what I understand from people who have them, it's a very popular building. It's a very vivid building. I mean, he's done buildings similarly in London. He's now doing buildings in West Africa where he's based, from what I understand. I won't speak for Ade, so
okay. What was special in that moment was how he managed to drive the narrative from slavery to
Zach, I'm gonna have to like
the building to the contemporary moment. Done?
I'm gonna have to. Yes. All right, David.
I just think one of the things is to kind of to answer Zach's earlier kind of challenge on artists come together with architects and how do we create this new vision of ourselves. I think people are doing that. People are doing that every day, and they always have been. But I think that the spirit of experimentation is the point. It is the spirit. It's the kind of pure essence of creativity. Go out there, create things, make things, try things, see what it looks like, see what it feels like, see how people respond to it. I think that's the first thing we should do. We need the space to do that more. We need the support to do that more. Often that's about financial, often that's about kind of the tools and the media, but there are different ways in which you can do that. And the other thing is just to almost kind of, Princess Marilyn in her rebuke earlier kind of proved the point, which is that there is a kind of, well, I talk about diversity a lot in the UK context, and I think Zach does as well. But what I've discovered very early on in that conversation was that I was really talking about my experience as a Black male from a certain generation. And actually to understand that there are other people who might have a different mode of communicating, and there's a different way of doing that, is a journey that I've been on, and it's a kind of welcome, it's a welcome opportunity to enrich what we're doing. I think that applies in this environment, because what I was saying earlier about almost being really forensic about who doesn't get to speak and who doesn't get to contribute and what intersectionalities they come from, because that just strengthens what we're looking at. And the broader answer to what Zach was asking might come from those kinds of conversations.
Okay, and I will move it to Princess Marilyn.
Oh, I think it's
too late
for me. No, I have nothing to add. Sorry.
Hello?
So I give my words to Zach, my time.
Okay. I mean, yeah.
Perfect.
Just to come back to you, David.
Thank you very much. Zach, do you want to do a quick one?
Yeah, please.
Zach?
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, just to say, David, I'm very excited to work with architects like yourself. For me, this is a fairly new thing in being even able to arrive in a position where you and I can discuss how we might navigate this future. So I'm very excited by this moment. I don't think there are enough opportunities right now for people of like you and I in this moment globally to start having this vision and sharing this. So in a way, I don't see that many people who are able to congregate in the way that we're discussing. And I'm hoping that this is something that changes in the future, and that we do get more opportunities to actually develop a building and the language of what happens within it, and that we can see institutions, not only in Britain, but on the continent and globally, that kind of presume to take on the guise of what we're trying to mold here today.
Okay, I think that's really good. Thank you. I'm going to, I think there's a question I would have wanted to ask, and I think it's important. We've talked about artists, we've talked about architects, and for me, the one question that really plagues me as a South African is how are we ready in thinking about public space to hand over the process of thinking about public space to the actual public? And you know, I don't ask it as a question that needs to be answered, but I think that's one of the things that really weighs heavily, and it's not a question that one can deal with in an hour. But I think that's a question that I want to leave, because I think you've all probably thought about this, but I think this is, for me, going forward, a thing that I would like you guys to think about is, when are we, or rather, are we ready to as artists, as architects, as people that are part of the public, steering committee, are we ready to also extend this privilege that we are now claiming to the public, and what that will look like? And I tell this because I've seen many public projects be undone by the public that, you know, like I would give an example of a park that was made where the gate was put in an aesthetically pleasing way, and people broke it down and created a new path. So for me, that's the question I want you guys to think of for going forward. And yeah, I put it as a question. I hope it's not too much of a spanner for thinking. But with that, I want to thank you very much. I'm happy to continue talking, as all for the time's passed. And I want to thank our audience, and I want to thank our panelists. You guys have really put a lot of interest in it. Thank you very much. And I want to thank 154 for actually allowing and facilitating this space. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah,
and
thank
again,
you for having me.
In a true South Africa, we can continue as people move.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have to leave, unfortunately, but it was fantastic.
Thank you, Princess Marilyn.
Meeting everyone. Yeah. And thank you, George, for your moderation. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank